part 5 of a series of unfortunate events with a wide window. Finally got the hard copy of the book. I'll be reading chapters 10 and 11. The good people who are publishing this book have a concern that they have expressed to me. The concern is that the readers like yourself will read my story of the Baudelaire orphans and attempt to imitate some of the things they do. So at this point in the story, in order to mollify the publishers, the word mollify here means get them to stop get them to stop tearing their hair out and worry. Please allow me to give you a piece of advice, even though I don't know anything about you. The piece of advice is as follows. If you ever need to get to Curdle Cave in a hurry, do not, under any circumstances, steal a boat and attempt to sail across Lake Lacrimose during a hurricane, because it is very dangerous and the chances of your survival are practically zero. You should especially not do this if, like the Baudelaire orphans, you have only a vague idea of how to work a sailboat. Count Olaf's comrade, standing at the dock and waving a chubby fist in the air, grew smaller and smaller as the wind carried the sailboat away from DeMockle's dock. As Hurricane Herman raged over them, Violet, Claus, and Sunny examined the sailboat they had just stolen. It was fairly small, with wooden seats and bright orange life jackets for 5 people. On top of the mast, which is a word meaning the tall wooden post found in the middle of the boats, was a grimy white sail controlled by a series of ropes, and the floor was a pair of wooden oars in case there was no wind. In the back, there was a sort of wooden lever with a handle for moving it this way and that, and under one of the seats was a shiny metal bucket for bailing out any water in case of a leak. There was also a long pole with a fishing net at the end of it, a small fishing rod with a sharp hook, and a rusty spying glass, which is a sort of telescope used for navigating. The 3 siblings struggled into their life vests as the stormy waves of Lake Lacrimose took them farther and farther away from the shore. I read a book about working a sailboat, Claus shouted over the noise of the hurricane. We have to use the sail to catch the wind. Then it will push us where we want to go. And this lever is called a tiller, Violet shouted. I remember it from studying some naval blueprints. The tiller controls the rudder, which is below the water, steering the ship. Sunny, sit back and work the tiller. Claus, hold the atlas so we can tell where we're going. And I'll try to work the sail. I think if I pull on this rope, I can control the sail. Claus turned the damp pages of the atlas to page 104. That way, he called, pointing to the right. The sun is setting over there, so that must be west. Sunny scurried to the back of the sailboat and put her tiny hands on the tiller just as a wave hit the boat and sprayed her with foam. Cartam, she called, which meant something along the lines of, I'm going to move this tiller this way in order to steer the boat according to Claus's recommendation. The rain whipped around them, and the wind howled, and a small wave splashed over the side, but to the orphans' amazement, the sailboat moved in the exact direction they wanted it to go. If you had come across the 3 Baudelaires at this moment, you would have had thought their lives were filled with joy and happiness, because even though they were exhausted, damp, and in great danger, they began to laugh in their triumph. They were so relieved that something had finally gone right that they laughed as if they were at the circus instead of in the middle of a lake, in the middle of a hurricane, in the middle of trouble. As the storm wore itself out, splashing waves over the sailboat and flashing lightning over their heads, the Baudelaires sailed the tiny boat across the vast and dark lake. Violet pulled ropes this way and that to catch the wind, which kept changing direction as winds tend to do. Claus kept a close eye on the atlas and made sure they weren't heading off course to the wicked whirlpool or the rancorous rocks. And Sunny kept the boat level by turning the tiller whenever Violet signaled. And just when the evening turned to night and it was too dark to read the atlas, the Baudelaires saw a blinking light of pale purple. The orphans had always thought lavender was a rather sickly color, but the first time in their lives they were glad to see it. It meant that the sailboat was approaching the lavender lighthouse, and soon they'd be at Curdle Cave. The storm finally broke, and the word broke here means ended rather than shattered or lost all its money. And the clouds parted to reveal an almost full moon. The children shivered in their soaking clothes and stared out at the calming waves of the lake, watching the swirls of its inky depths. Lake Lachrymose is actually pretty, very pretty, Claus said thoughtfully. I never noticed it before. Sinned, Sunny agreed, adjusting the tiller slightly. I guess we never noticed it because of Aunt Josephine, Violet said. We got used to looking at the lake through their eyes. She picked up the spying glass and squinted into it, and she was just able to see the shore. I think I can see the lighthouse over there. There's a dark hole in the cliff right next to it. It must be the mouth of Curdled Cave. Sure enough, as the sailboat drew closer and closer, the children could just make out the lavender lighthouse and the mouth of the nearby cave, but when they looked into its depths, they could see no sign of Aunt Josephine, or of anything else for that matter. Here is a picture of them. It must be when they were battling the storm. Rocks began to scrape the bottom of the boat, which meant they were in very shallow water, and Violet jumped out to drag the sailboat onto the craggy shore. Claus and Sunny stepped out of the boat and took off their life jackets. Then they stood at the mouth of Curdled Cave and paused nervously. In front of the cave, there was a sign saying it was for sale, and the orphans could not imagine who would want to buy such a phantasmorical. The word phantasmorical here means all the creepy, scary words you could think of put together. Place. The mouth of the cave had jagged rocks all over it, like teeth in the mouth of a shark. Just beyond the entrance, the youngsters could see strange white rock formations, all melted and twisted together, so they looked like moldy milk. Oh. The floor of the cave was as pale and dusty as if it were made of chalk, but it was not these sights that made the children pause. It was a sound coming out of the cave. It was a high-pitched, wavering wail, a hopeless and lost sound, as strange and as eerie as Curdled Cave itself. What's that sound? Violet asked nervously. Just the wind, probably, Claus replied. I read somewhere that when wind passes through small places, like caves, it can make weird noises. It's nothing to be afraid of. The orphans did not move. The sound did not stop. I'm afraid of it anyway, Violet said. Me too, Claus said. Ginny, Sunny said, and began to crawl into the mouth of the cave. She probably meant something along the lines of, we didn't sail a stolen sailboat across Lake Lachrymose in the middle of a Hurricane Herman just to stand nervously at the mouth of a cave. And her siblings had to agree with her and follow her inside. The wailing was louder as it echoed off the walls and rock formations, and the Baudelaires could tell it wasn't the wind. It was Aunt Josephine, sitting in a corner of the cave and sobbing with her head in her hands. She was crying so hard that she hadn't even noticed the Baudelaires come into the cave. Aunt Josephine, Claus said hesitantly, we're here. Aunt Josephine looked up, and the children could see that her face was wet from tears and chalky from the cave. You figured it out, she said, wiping her eyes and standing up. I knew you could figure it out, she said, and took each of the Baudelaires in her arms. She looked at Violet, and then at Claus, and then at Sunny, and the orphans looked at her and found themselves with tears in their eyes as they greeted their guardian. It was as if they had not quite believed that Aunt Josephine's death was fake until they had seen her alive with their own eyes. I knew you were clever children, Aunt Josephine said. I knew you could read my message. Claus really did it, Violet said. But Violet knew how to work the sailboat, Claus said. Without Violet, we would have never arrived here. And Sunny stole the keys, Violet said, and worked the tiller. Well, I'm glad you all made it here, Aunt Josephine said. Let me just try to catch my breath, and I'll help you bring in your things. The children looked at one another. What things? Violet asked. Why, your luggage, of course, Aunt Josephine replied. And I hope you brought some food, because the supplies I brought are almost gone. We didn't bring any food, Claus said. No food, Aunt Josephine said. How in the world are you going to live with me in this cave if you didn't bring any food? We didn't come here to live with you, Violet said. Aunt Josephine's hands flew to her head, and she rearranged her bun nervously. Then why are you here? She asked. Stim, Sunny shrieked, which meant, because we were worried about you. Stim is not a sentence, Sunny, Aunt Josephine said sternly. Perhaps one of your older siblings could explain in correct English why you're here. Because Captain Sham almost had us in his clutches, Violet cried. Everyone thought you were dead, And you wrote in your will and testament that we should be placed in the care of Captain Sham. But he forced me to do that, Aunt Josephine whined. That night, when he called me on the phone, he told me he was really Count Olaf. He said I had to write out a will saying you children would be left in his care. And he said if I didn't write it, what he said, he would drown me in the lake. I was so frightened that I agreed immediately. Why didn't you call the police? Ella asked. Why didn't you call Mr. Poe? Why didn't you call somebody who could have helped you? You know why, Aunt Josephine said crossly. I'm afraid of using the phone. Why, I was just getting used to answering it. I'm nowhere near ready to use the numbered buttons. But in any case, I didn't need to call anybody. I threw a footstool through the window, and then I sneaked out of the house. I left you the note so that you would know I wasn't really dead, but I hid my message so that Captain Sham wouldn't know I had escaped from him. Why didn't you take us with you? Why did you leave us all alone by ourselves? Why didn't you protect us from Captain Sham? Claus asked. It is not grammatically correct, Aunt Josephine said, to say leave us all alone by ourselves. You can say leave us all alone or leave us by ourselves, but not both. Do you understand? The Baudelaires looked at one another in sadness and anger. They understood. They understood that Aunt Josephine was more concerned with grammatical mistakes than saving the lives of the three children. They understood that she was so wrapped up in her own fears that she had not given a thought to what might have happened to them. They understood that Aunt Josephine had been a terrible guardian in leaving the children all by themselves in great danger. They understood, and they wished more than ever that their parents, who never would have run away and left them alone, had not been killed in that terrible fire which had just begun all the misfortune in the Baudelaires' lives. Well, enough grammar lessons for today, Aunt Josephine said. I'm happy to see you, and you are welcome to share this cave with me. I don't think Captain Sham will ever find us here. We're not staying here, Violet said impatiently. We're sailing back to town, and we're taking you with us. No way, Jose, Aunt Josephine said, using an expression which means no way, and has nothing to do with Jose, whoever he is. I'm too frightened of Captain Sham to face him. After all he's done to you, I would think that you would be frightened of him too. We are frightened of him, Claus said, but if we prove that he's really Count Olaf, he will go to jail. You are the proof. If you tell Mr. Poe what happened, then Count Olaf will be locked away and we will be safe. You can tell him if you want to, Aunt Josephine said. I'm staying here. He won't believe us unless you come with us and prove that you're alive, Violet said. No, Aunt Josephine said. I'm too afraid. Violet took a deep breath and faced her frightened guardian. We're all afraid, she said firmly. We were afraid when we met Captain Sham in the grocery store. We were afraid when we thought that you had jumped out the window. We were afraid to give ourselves allergic reactions, and we were afraid to sail a sailboat, and we were afraid to make our way across this lake in the middle of a hurricane. But that didn't stop us. Aunt Josephine's eyes filled with tears. I can't help it that you're braver than I, she said. I am not sailing across that lake. I'm not making any phone calls. I'm going to stay right here for the rest of my life, and nothing you can say will change my mind. Claus stepped forward and played his trump card, a phrase which here means said something very convincing, which he had saved for the end of the argument. Curdle's Cave, he said, is for sale. So what? Aunt Josephine said. That means, Claus said, that before long, certain people will come look at it. And some of those people, he paused dramatically, will be realtors. Aunt Josephine's mouth hung open, and the orphans watched her pale throat swallow in fear. Okay, she said finally, looking around the cave anxiously, as if a realtor were already hiding in the shadows. I'll go. Chapter 11. Oh, no, Aunt Josephine said. The children paid no attention. The worst of Hurricane Herman was over, and the Baudelaires sailed across the dark lake. As the Baudelaires sailed across the dark lake, there seemed to be very little danger. Violet moved the sail around with ease now that the wind was calm. Claus looked back at the lavender light of the lighthouse and confidently guided the way back to DeMockle's dock, and Sunny moved the tiller as if she had been a tiller mover all her life. Only Aunt Josephine was scared. She was wearing 2 life jackets instead of 1, and every few seconds she cried, "Oh no," even though nothing frightening was happening. "Oh no," Aunt Josephine said, "and I mean it this time." What's wrong, Aunt Josephine? Violet said tiredly. The sailboat had reached the approximate middle of the lake. The water was still fairly calm, and the lighthouse still glowed, a pinpoint of pale purple light. There seemed to be no cause for alarm. We're about to enter the territory of lachrymose leeches, Aunt Josephine said. I'm sure we'll pass through safely, Claus said, peering through the spying glass to see if DeMarco's dock was visible yet. You told us that the leeches were harmless and only preyed on small fish. Unless you've eaten recently, Aunt Josephine said. And it's been hours since we've eaten, Violet said soothingly. The last we ate were peppermints at the Anxious Clown. That was in the afternoon, and now it's the middle of the night. Aunt Josephine looked down and moved away from the middle of the boat. But I ate a banana, she whispered, just before you arrived. Oh, no, Violet said. Sonny stopped moving the tiller and looked worriedly into the water. I'm sure there's nothing to worry about. Claus said, leeches are very small animals. If we were in the water, we might have reason to fear, but I don't think they'd attack a sailboat. Plus Hurricane Herman might have frightened them away from their territory. I bet the lachrymose leeches won't even show up. Claus thought he was done speaking for the moment, but in the moment that followed, he added one more sentence. The sentence was, speak of the devil. It is an expression that you use when you are talking about something only to have it occur. For instance, if you were at a picnic and said, I hope it doesn't snow, and at that very minute a blizzard began, you could say, speak of the devil, before gathering up your blanket and potato salad and driving away to a good restaurant. But in the case of the Baudelaire orphans, I'm sure you can guess what happened to prompt Claus to use that expression. Speak of the devil, Claus said, looking into the waters of the lake. Out of the swirling blackness came skinny, rising shapes, barely visible in the moonlight. The shapes were scarcely longer than a finger, and at first it looked as if someone were swimming in the lake and drumming their fingers on the surface of the water. But most people only have 10 fingers, and in the few minutes that followed, there were hundreds of these tiny shapes, wriggling hungrily from all sides toward the sailboat. The lachrymose leeches made a quiet whispering sound in the water as they swam, as if the Baudelaire orphans were surrounded by people murmuring terrible secrets. The children watched in silence as the swarm approached the boat, each leech knocking lightly against the wood. Their tiny leech mouths puckered in disappointment as they tried to taste the sailboat. Leeches are blind, but they aren't stupid, and the lachrymose leeches knew that they were not eating a banana. You see, Claus said nervously, as the tapping of leech mouths continued, we're perfectly safe. Yes, Violet said. She wasn't sure they were perfectly safe, not at all, but it seemed best to tell Aunt Josephine they were perfectly safe. We're perfectly safe, she said. The tapping sound continued, getting a little rougher and louder. Frustration is an interesting emotional state, because it tends to bring out the worst in whoever is frustrated. Frustrated babies tend to throw food and make a mess. Frustrated citizens tend to execute kings and queens and make a democracy. And frustrated moths tend to bang up against light bulbs and make light fixtures all dusty. But unlike babies, citizens, and moths, leeches are quite unpleasant to begin with. Now that lachrymose leeches were getting frustrated, everyone on board the sailboat was quite anxious to see what would happen when frustration brought out the worst in the leeches. For a while, the small creatures tried to eat the wood, but their tiny teeth didn't really do anything but make an unpleasant knocking sound. But then, all at once, the leeches knocked off, and the Baudelaires watched them wriggle away from the sailboat. They're leaving, Claus said hopefully. But they weren't leaving. When the leeches had reached a considerable distance, they suddenly swiveled their tiny bodies around and came rushing back to the boat with a loud thwack. The leeches all hit the boat more or less at once, and the sailboat rocked precariously, a word which here means in a way that almost threw Aunt Josephine and the Baudelaire youngsters to their doom. The 4 passengers were rocked to and fro and almost fell into the waters of the lake, where the leeches were wriggling away again to prepare for another attack. Yedek, Sonny shrieked, and pointed to the side of the boat. Yedek, of course, is not a grammatically correct English, but even Aunt Josephine understood that the youngest Baudelaire meant, look at the crack in the boat that the leeches have made. The crack was a tiny one, but as long as a pencil and about as wide as a human hair, and it was curved downward so it looked as if the sailboat were frowning at them. If the leeches kept hitting the side of the boat, the frown would only get wider. We have to sail much faster, Claus said, or this boat will be in pieces in no time. But sailing relies on the wind, Violet pointed out. We can't make the wind go faster. I'm frightened, Aunt Josephine cried. Please don't throw me overboard. Nobody's going to throw you overboard, Violet said impatiently. Although I'm sorry to tell you that Violet was wrong about that. Take an oar, Aunt Josephine. Claus, take another one. And if we sail and the tiller and the oars, we could move more quickly. Whack! The lachrymose leeches hit the side of the boat, widening the crack in the side and rocking the boat again. One of the leeches was thrown over the side in the impact and twisted this way and that on the floor of the boat, gnashing its tiny teeth as it looked for food. Grimacing, Claus walked cautiously over to it and tried to kick the leech overboard, but it clung onto his shoe and began gnawing through the leather. With a cry of disgust, Claus shook his leg, and the leech fell to the floor of the sailboat again, stretching its tiny neck and opening and shutting its mouth. Violet grabbed the long pole with the net at the end of it, scooped up the leech, and tossed it overboard. Thwack! The crack widened enough that a bit of water began to dribble through, making a small puddle on the sailboat's floor. Sonny, Violet said, keep an eye on that puddle. When it gets bigger, use the bucket to throw it back in the lake. Muffy, Sonny shrieked, which meant, I certainly will. There was the whispering sound as the leeches swam away. There was the whispering sound as the leeches swam away to ram the boat again. Claus and Aunt Josephine began rowing as hard as they could, while Violet adjusted the sail and kept the net in her hand for more leeches who got on board. Thwack, thwack! There were two more loud noises now, one on the side of the boat and one at the bottom, which cracked immediately. The leeches had divided up into two teams, which is good news for playing kickball, but bad news if you're being attacked. Aunt Josephine gave a shriek of terror. Water was now leaking into the sailboat into two spots, and Sonny abandoned the tiller to bail the water back out. Claus stopped rowing and held the oar up without a word. It had several small bite marks in it, the work of the lachrymose leeches. Rowing isn't going to work, he reported to Violet solemnly. If we row any more, these oars will be completely eaten. Violet watched Sonny crawl around with a bucket full of water. Rowing won't help us anyway, she said. This boat is sinking. We need help. Claus looked around at the dark and still waters, empty except for the sailboat and the swarm of leeches. Where can we get help in the middle of a lake? She asked. We're going to have to signal for help, Violet said, and reached into her pocket and took out a ribbon. Handing Claus the fishing net, she used the ribbon to tie her hair up, keeping out of her eyes. Claus and Sonny watched her, knowing that she only tied up her hair in this way when she was thinking of an invention, and right now they needed an invention quite desperately. That's right, Aunt Josephine said to Violet. Close your eyes. That's what I do when I'm afraid, and it always makes me feel better to black out with fear. She's not blacking out anything, Claus said crossly. She's concentrating. Claus was right. Violet concentrated as hard as she could, racking her brain for a good way to signal for help. She thought of fire alarms, with flashing lights and loud sirens. Fire alarms were an excellent way to signal for assistance. Although the Baudelaire orphans, of course, sadly knew that sometimes the fire engines arrived too late to save people's lives, a fire alarm was still a good invention, and Violet tried to think of a way she could imitate it using the materials around her. She needed to make a loud sound to get somebody's attention, and she needed to make a bright light so that person would know where they are. Thwack, thwack. The two teams of leeches hit the boat again, and there was a splash as more water came pouring into the sailboat. Sonny started to fill the bucket with water, but Violet reached forward and took it from Sonny's hands. Barrow? Sonny shrieked, which meant, Aren't you crazy? Are you crazy? But Violet had no time to answer. No, as a matter of fact, I'm not. So she merely said no, and holding the bucket in one hand, began to climb up the mast. It is difficult enough to climb up the mast of a boat, but it is triple the difficulty if the boat is being rocked by a bunch of hungry leeches. So allow me to advise you that this is another thing that you should under no circumstances try to do. But Violet Baudelaire was a wonder kid, a German word which here means someone who is able to quickly climb masts on boats being attacked by leeches. And soon she was on the top of the swaying mast of the boat, She took the bucket and hung it by its handle on the tip of the mast so it swung this way and that, the way a bell might do in a bell tower. "I don't mean to interrupt you," Claus called, scooping up a furious leech in the net and tossing it as far as he could. "But this boat is really sinking. Please hurry." Violet hurried. Hurriedly, she grabbed a hold of a corner of a snail and, taking a deep breath to prepare herself, jumped back down to the floor of the boat. Just as she hoped, the sail ripped as she hurtled to the ground, slowing her down and leaving her with a large piece of torn cloth. By now, the sailboat had quite a lot of water in it, and Violet splashed over Aunt Josephine, avoiding the many leeches that Claus was tossing out of the boat as quickly as he could. "I need your oar," Violet said, wadding the piece of sail up into a ball, "and your hairnet." "You can have the oar," Aunt Josephine said, handing it over, "but I need my hairnet. It keeps my butt in place." "Give her the hairnet," Claus cried, hopping up on one of the seats as a leech tried to bite his knee. "But I'm scared of having hair in my face." Aunt Josephine whined, just as another pair of thwacks hit the boat. "I don't have time to argue with you," Violet cried. "I'm trying to save each of our lives. Give me your hairnet now." "The expression," Aunt Josephine said, "is saving all of our lives, not each of our lives." But Violet had heard enough. Splashing forward and avoiding a pair of wriggling leeches, the eldest Baudelaire reached forward and grabbed Aunt Josephine's hairnet off her head. She wrapped the crumpled part of the sail in the hairnet, and then grabbed the fishing pole and attached the messy bun of the cloth to the fishhook. It looked like she was about to go fishing for some kind of fish that liked sailboats and hairnets for food. Thwack, thwack! The sailboat tilted to one side and then the other. The leeches had almost smashed their way through the side. Violet took the oar and began to rub it up and down the side of the boat as fast and as hard as she could. "What are you doing?" Claus asked, catching 3 leeches in one swoop of his net. "I'm trying to create friction," Violet said. "If I rub 2 pieces of wood enough, I'll create friction. Friction creates sparks. When I get a spark, I'll set the cloth and hairnet on fire and use it as a signal." "You want to set a fire?" Claus cried. "But a fire will mean more danger." "Not if I wave the fire over my head, using the fishing pole," Violet said. "I'll do that and hit the bucket like a bell, and that should create enough of a signal to fetch us some help." She rubbed and rubbed the oar against the side of the boat, but no sparks appeared. The sad truth was that the wood was too wet from Hurricane Herman and from Lake Lachrymose to create enough friction to start a fire. It was a good idea, but Violet realized, as she rubbed and rubbed without any result, that it was the wrong idea. Thwack, thwack! Violet looked around at Aunt Josephine and her terrified siblings and felt hope leak out of her heart as quickly as water was leaking into a boat. "It's not working," Violet said miserably, and felt tears fall down her cheeks. She thought of the promise she made to her parents shortly before they were killed, that she would always take care of her younger siblings. The leeches swarmed around the sinking boat, and Violet feared that she had not lived up to her promise. "It's not working," she said again, and dropped the oar in despair. "We need a fire, but I can't invent one." "It's okay," Claus said, even though, of course, it was not. "We'll think of something." "Tintet," Sunny said, which meant something along the lines of, "Don't cry. You tried your best." But Violet cried anyway. It is very easy to say that the important thing is to try your best, but if you are in real trouble, the most important thing is not trying your best, but getting to safety. The boat rocked back and forth, and water poured through the cracks, and Violet cried because it looked like they would never get to safety. Her shoulders shaking with sobs, she held the spying glass up to her eye to see if, by any chance, there was a boat nearby, or if the tide had happened to carry the sailboat to shore. But all she could see was the moonlight reflecting on rippling waters of the lake. And this was a lucky thing, because as soon as Violet saw the flickering reflection, she remembered the scientific principles of convergence and refraction of light. The scientific principles of convergence and refraction of light are very confusing, and quite frankly, I can't make head or tail of them, even when my friend Dr. Lorenz explains them to me. But they made perfect sense to Violet. Instantly, she thought of a story her father had told her long ago when she was just beginning to be interested in science. When her father was a boy, he had a dreadful cousin who liked to burn ants, starting a fire by focusing the light of the sun with her magnifying glass. Burning ants, of course, is an abhorrent hobby. The word abhorrent here means what Count Olaf used to do when he was about your age. But remembering the story made Violet see that she could use the lens of a spying glass to focus the light of the moon and make a fire. Without wasting another moment, she grabbed the spying glass and removed the lens, and then, looking up at the moon, tilted the lens at an angle she hastily computed in her head. The moonlight passed through the lens and was concentrated into a long, thin band of light, like a glowing thread leading right to the piece of sail, held in a ball by Aunt Josephine's hairnet. In a moment, the thread had become a small flame. "It's miraculous," Claus cried, as the flame took hold. "It's unbelievable," Aunt Josephine cried. "Bonty," Sunny shrieked. "It's the scientific principles of convergence and refraction of light," Violet cried, wiping her eyes. Stepping carefully to avoid onboard leeches, and so as not to put out the fire, she moved to the front of the boat. With one hand, she took the oar and rang the bucket, making a loud sound to get somebody's attention. With the other hand, she held the fishing rod up high, making a bright light so the person would know where they were. Violet looked up at her homemade signaling device that had finally caught fire, all because of a silly story her father had told her. Her father's aunt-burning cousin sounded like a dreadful person, but if she had suddenly appeared on the sailboat, Violet would have given her a big, grateful hug. As it turned out, however, this signal was a mixed blessing, a phrase which here means something half good and half bad. Somebody saw the signal almost immediately, somebody who was already sailing in the lake, and who headed toward the Baudelaires in an instant. Violet, Claus, and Sunny, and even Aunt Josephine, all grinned as they saw another boat sail into view. They were being rescued, and that was the good half. But their smiles began to fade as the boat drew closer, and they saw who was sailing it. Aunt Josephine and the orphan saw the wooden peg leg, and the navy blue sailor cap, and the eye patch, and they knew who was coming to their aid. It was Captain Sham, of course, and he was probably the worst half in the world.